In the Viking world, there was no greater crime than being seen as less than a man. Strength, dominance, and honor were not just valued. They were demanded. Any man who failed to meet these expectations faced more than ridicule.
The blood eagle, which involves ripping the chest apart and pulling the lungs out like wings.
He faced total destruction. Viking law had a word that could end a man's life without mercy. It was not an insult, it was a sentence. Once spoken, it could strip away all protection, cast him from his home, and mark him for death.
Find in much later accounts is not described by their enemies who are looking for.
These punishments were not secret. They were carried out in full view of the community to make an example. What the Vikings did to men they saw as feminine will seriously shock you to the core. The sacred code of Viking masculinity. In Viking society, masculinity was not a matter of personality. It was law. It ruled every step of a man's life, from birth to death, and it was enforced with consequences that destroyed anyone who failed to live up to it. A male child was not simply raised, he was trained, shaped, and judged from the start. The expectation was clear. A man must grow into an image of strength, courage, and honor, or be cast aside. These were not ideals. They were requirements. Honor, referred to as drengskaper in Old Norse, was seen as the foundation of manhood. A man without honor was considered incomplete, untrustworthy, and socially defective. And defective men were not protected. They were seen as liabilities. The sagas, which were epic prose narratives recounting the lives of warriors, kings, and farmers, provide countless examples of this code in action. In Egil's saga, the hero's status and survival are tied entirely to his ability to fight, speak boldly, and command respect. Even outside of warfare, masculinity was tested through acts of bravery and exploration, hard physical labor, and the ability to defend one's family and property. Weakness, hesitation, or dependency on others for protection could lead to public questioning of a man's worth. The Viking legal system reinforced this value structure. A man's testimony carried weight in court only if his reputation for honor was intact. In disputes, whether over land, trade, or marriage contracts, an honorable man's word could sway the outcome. A dishonorable man, however, could be ignored entirely, stripped of legal standing without any formal trial. This meant that maintaining one's masculine reputation was not merely about pride, but about preserving the ability to function within society's framework. Masculinity also carried a deeply spiritual significance. In Norse mythology, the gods themselves embodied ideals of strength, cunning, and vengeance. Thor represented brute force and the defense of the divine order, while Odin's authority stemmed from his wisdom, knowledge of magic, and ability to command loyalty. However, even Odin's use of cider, a form of Norse sorcery, was criticized in some sagas as unmanly. If even the highest god could be accused, no mortal was safe. This rigidity meant that any deviation from expected masculine conduct could have devastating consequences. The community was vigilant in policing behavior, and accusations of weakness or moral corruption could spread quickly. In a society where survival depended on loyalty and cooperation among warriors, the presence of a man deemed unworthy of trust was seen as a threat to the group's stability. Such a man risked not only his personal honor, but the standing of his entire family line. This environment created a culture of constant performance, where every word, gesture, and decision could affirm or destroy a man's standing. It was within this unforgiving structure that one single word emerged as the most feared accusation a man could face. This word could strip him of rights, kinship, and life itself. What it means to be called Argr. In Viking society, one word had the power to destroy a man's life more completely than any weapon. That word was Argr. On the surface, it meant unmanly. In reality, it was a lethal accusation that placed a man outside the protections of law and honor. Under Norse law, especially the Icelandic Gragas, calling someone Argr was a formal declaration that the man was no longer fit to stand among honorable men. To be labeled Argr was to be accused of behaviors considered the exact opposite of the Viking ideal of masculinity. The accusation of Argr triggered an immediate, unavoidable test. The accused man had to prove his honor by accepting a formal duel. This was not optional. If he refused, the law treated that refusal as a public admission that the charge was true. There was no investigation, no witnesses, and no evidence required. Worse off, silence was seen as guilt. Once guilt was assumed, the punishment was swift and total. The man could be declared an outlaw, stripped of all legal rights, forced into exile, and have his property seized. Outlawry meant he could be killed by anyone, anywhere, without the killer facing legal consequences. In effect, the community was given permission to hunt him. The danger of Argr lay in its speed. A man could spend decades building his reputation by forging alliances and protecting his kin. But a single public accusation could destroy it instantly. Winning the duel could clear his name for the moment, but the stain often lingered. Enemies could repeat the accusation, forcing him into repeated challenges. One loss or one refusal to fight, and his life would be over in every practical sense. The sagas show how this word became a weapon in feuds, power struggles, and even disputes between rulers. Some men used it strategically to eliminate rivals, knowing the law left the accused no safe escape. In these cases, Argr was not just an insult, it was a calculated legal trap. The moment it was spoken in public, the accused was thrust into a deadly choice: fight and risk death, or refuse and face certain ruin. So who exactly do the Vikings deem feminine men? What the Vikings saw as feminine in a man. The first category of feminine behavior involved the reversal of expected roles. In Viking culture, a man was expected to be dominant and physically assertive in any relationship. Taking what was seen as a passive role with another man was considered a complete inversion of masculine identity. It was not the relationship itself that was condemned, but the perceived loss of dominance and control. This belief was so strong that such an accusation could ruin a man instantly, even without witnesses or proof, because it suggested he had surrendered the very essence of manhood. The second category involved cowardice or physical timidity. Vikings valued fearless action in the face of danger, whether in battle, exploration, or defense of home and kin. A man who avoided confrontation, failed to defend his property, or fled from combat without an overwhelming reason could be accused of weakness. In a warrior society, hesitation in battle was more than a personal flaw. It was a threat to the safety and honor of the entire group. The third category was the practice of certain types of magic, most notably Seidr. This form of sorcery was widely respected when performed by women, who were believed to have a natural connection to it. For men, however, the practice was highly unacceptable. Seidr required states of trance, ritual singing, and spiritual submission, all qualities Vikings coded as feminine. Even Odin, the highest of the gods, was mocked in the sagas for using Seidr, and his critics used it to question his manhood. A mortal man practicing this art risked being seen as corrupted, unnatural, and morally unfit to lead or protect others. Finally, there was the category of social dependency. A man was expected to be self-sufficient, to provide for his household, and to defend it without leaning on others for basic protection. Becoming reliant on another man for safety or sustenance without necessity could be read as a sign of weakness. Such dependency undermined the Viking image of the independent, capable warrior and placed a man uncomfortably close to the dependent role expected of women in that era. Once a man had crossed the line into what Viking society considered feminine, the punishment rarely began with the law. It started with the community itself. Before any formal trial or sentence, there were public rituals designed to shame and isolate him. Public humiliation as a weapon. One of the most feared tools of public shaming was the nidstong, which is a carved shame pole. It was often topped with the head of a horse or another animal, sometimes mounted backward to symbolize perversion of the natural order. The pole would be inscribed or marked with runes, declaring the man Argr and cursing him. Placed in a visible spot, it told everyone in the community that the target had failed as a man. In the Viking worldview, this was not just mockery. It was a public claim that the man was dangerous to honor and should be treated accordingly. Mocking verse was another devastating method. The Vikings valued poetry and song, and the Senna, verbal dueling, or flyting, ritual insult exchange, could turn the crowd against a man in minutes. If a skilled poet publicly accused him of practicing women's magic or showing cowardice, the audience would remember those words for years. Verse could travel far beyond the immediate circle, carrying the accusation to other settlements. Effigies were sometimes used to make the accusation physical. These could depict the man in poses or clothing considered feminine. Such displays were placed in public spaces, ensuring that anyone passing by would see the message. The combination of laughter, mockery, and visual proof worked to convince others that the accusation was already common knowledge. The goal of all these acts was to isolate the accused. Friends, allies, and even family might avoid being seen with him to protect their own reputations. This social isolation was a form of pressure to push him toward a defensive outburst that could be used against him or make him appear too weak to respond. Public humiliation also served as a warning to others. By making an example of one man, the community reminded every other man where the boundaries of masculinity lay. It was a display of control, showing that reputation could be destroyed without a single sword being drawn. Once the humiliation had done its work, the next step was almost inevitable. A man accused of being feminine could not simply deny it. Viking law demanded a direct and dangerous answer that would decide his fate in front of the same people who had already been primed to doubt him. That answer came through the ritual of Holmgang. Trial by steel, Holmgang, and the defense of honor. When a man was accused of Argr, the law offered only one path to clear his name: Holmgang, a formal, one-on-one duel. This was a structured legal event with agreed rules, witnesses, and a set battleground. The duel served as the court, the judge, and the executioner all at once. The battleground was marked out in advance, and it is often a square measuring just a few paces across. In some traditions, the fighters stood on animal hides or within a roped enclosure, forcing them into constant, close contact. Weapons were agreed upon beforehand, most often swords, but sometimes spears or axes. Each man was allowed a set number of shields, often 3. Once a shield was shattered, the fighter had to fight on with fewer defenses. Stepping outside the marked ground could mean immediate defeat, so movement was restricted, and every inch of space mattered. The duel had witnesses to ensure no cheating. Fighters might swear oaths before beginning, declaring they were armed only with agreed weapons and carried no hidden magic. The combat was fought in timed rounds or until one man was unable to continue. Victory came through taking the life of the opponent, wounding him so severely that he could no longer fight, or forcing him to yield. However, yielding was rare as it carried heavy shame. Tactics were everything. The enclosed space meant footwork was limited, so raw aggression or defensive patience could decide the outcome. Fighters used shield edges to strike, weapon pommels to daze, and feints to open defenses. One wrong step could leave a man pinned with no room to maneuver. Spectators were not silent. They could shout encouragement, mock a struggling fighter, or urge one to finish the other quickly. The atmosphere was tense and often hostile, with the crowd ready to witness violence. When the fight ended, the victor would stand in clear view, weapon in hand, while the loser would lay broken on the ground, a horrifying scene that left no doubt about the result. Holmgang was a test of nerve, skill, and endurance, and it demanded that a man prove himself in the most direct way possible, blade against blade, with everyone watching. So, what exactly happens to those who lose? Skoggangr, sent into the forest to die. Skoggangr, which means going into the forest, was the Viking world's harshest legal punishment. It was not a term of imprisonment, and it was not exile in the modern sense. It was the complete removal of a man from human society, with no right to return. Once the sentence was declared, the condemned was no longer recognized as a person under the law. The process was public. At the assembly, the sentence was announced before witnesses, and the man's legal protections were stripped away in words everyone could hear. From that moment, he could no longer seek shelter in any home, receive food, or take part in trade. Even his closest kin risked punishment for offering him aid. This was not simply a punishment, it was a public declaration that he no longer belonged to the human world. Survival meant fleeing beyond the edges of farms and settlements into wilderness that was as hostile as any enemy. In Iceland, this meant volcanic rock fields that could cut through boots, highlands where the wind never stopped, and winters that could freeze a man in hours. In Norway, it meant dark, endless forests, freezing fjords, and mountains where predators roamed. There were no safe havens, no supply routes, no allies. The law made every living soul a threat. Anyone could kill an outlaw on sight, and many were eager to try. Some sought the reward of claiming his abandoned property. Others hunted for personal vengeance. Opportunists might kill him simply to prove their own bravery or gain a story to tell. The condemned could trust no one. Even a familiar face on the horizon might mean death. Life under Skoggangr was a relentless test of endurance and paranoia. Every decision carried risk. He had to keep moving to avoid detection, but movement left tracks that skilled hunters could follow. Fires could keep the cold from killing him, but even a faint column of smoke could reveal his hiding place. Starvation was a constant threat. To steal food or slaughter livestock meant risking discovery. To forage meant long hours of exposure, often in freezing rain or deep snow. Sleep was shallow and restless, broken by every noise in the dark. The sagas speak of rare men like Grettir Asmundarson, who survived for years in this state by living in caves, hunting at night, and relying on his legendary strength. But Grettir was an exception. Most outlaws lasted only weeks or months. Frostbite, hypothermia, and exhaustion could end their lives in silence. Others were cornered and cut down. In these cases, their deaths were often quick but merciless. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical. The constant awareness that every person met could be a killer eroded trust, hope, and sanity. And yet, death was not the worst fate in Viking society. What followed was colder than the wind and more final than the sword. An outlaw's death was often without funeral, without burial rites, without even the recovery of the body. Worse still, his name would be deliberately erased from family histories. Erased from bloodlines, the social death. In Viking culture, death in battle was honorable. Even a loss could be remembered with pride if a man fought bravely. But for men labeled Argr, feminine in the Viking sense, the end was far worse. Their death was followed by erasure. This was not accidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and permanent. Family lineage was everything in Norse society. A man's worth came not only from his own deeds, but from the reputation of his ancestors and the alliances those names secured. Genealogies were recited at feasts, recorded in sagas, and carved in stone to prove land rights and social standing. To be remembered was to remain part of the community even after death. But when a man was declared feminine, his name was cut from the chain. The erasure was methodical. His name could be left out of family histories, skipped over when ancestry was spoken aloud, or erased from legal records. Sagas often show these silent gaps, where a bloodline jumps a generation without explanation. Property documents might be rewritten to act as if he had never owned land. This was not just about shame, it was self-preservation. A family tied to a man labeled feminine risked losing marriage prospects, political allies, and legal support. The stain could spread to anyone connected to him. Removing him from memory was a way to protect the rest of the bloodline. The result was a second death. The first took the body. The second took the memory. No sagas, no songs, no grave to visit. In a culture where memory was the only path to immortality, this was the ultimate destruction. Real men punished for feminine acts. While the term Argr and its consequences might sound like legend, saga records, Viking Age law codes, and court records, particularly Iceland's Gragas and Norwegian assembly traditions, show that accusations of being feminine had very real victims. These men were destroyed because their behavior, or even rumors about it, violated the rigid Viking definition of masculinity. One early example appears in Eyrbyggja saga, where a man named Thorgils Arason was accused by a rival of taking what was viewed in Viking society as a socially passive role in an intimate relationship with another man. The accusation did not center on same-gender contact itself, but on the belief that passivity in such a relationship was incompatible with the ideals of masculine honor. For the Vikings, a man's public standing depended on being seen as dominant, independent, and assertive in all areas of life. The charge was made openly before others, forcing Thorgils into a Holmgang, a formal duel, to prove his honor. He won that fight, but the accusation resurfaced later, compelling him to defend himself again. This cycle of challenges drained his resources and weakened his political alliances, eventually eroding his influence in the district. In Gisli's saga, the character Eyjolf the Grey is mocked in verse for being cowardly and unwilling to fight when provoked. While this might seem minor, the sagas show how quickly such words could escalate into formal challenges. Eyjolf's hesitation in battle was used as proof of his unmanliness, and he became a target for others seeking to claim his land and standing. The historical Icelandic law code Gragas contains multiple references to cases where men were outlawed after failing to respond to charges of being Argr. One recorded judgment describes a man named Argr who was insulted during a dispute over grazing rights. He refused to fight, insisting the insult was baseless, but the assembly took his silence as admission. He was sentenced to full outlawry and removed from the historical record. In one case from the late 900s, a chieftain's son was accused of watching an armed raid without intervening. The court judged that his failure to act was proof of unmanly conduct and fined his family heavily, while also barring him from speaking in assembly for life. Even spiritual figures could not escape such attacks. Snorri Sturluson, in the Ynglinga saga, writes that the god Odin himself was accused of unmanly behavior for practicing Seder, Norse magic traditionally performed by women. While Odin was too powerful for anyone to act against him, the fact that such an accusation could be leveled at a god shows how deep the cultural taboo ran. These examples reveal a brutal reality. The accusation itself was often enough to ruin a man, regardless of whether the claim was true. Public perception mattered more than evidence, and rivals used the charge strategically to eliminate opponents. In many cases, the punishment was not a single moment, but a process. First social isolation, then public humiliation, and finally, legal destruction. The sagas do not always tell us what became of these men, but the pattern is clear. Once branded feminine in the Viking world, survival was a battle fought every day, with the odds stacked heavily against the accused. But why exactly did the Vikings go to these extreme lengths? Fear, power, and the legacy of Argr. The brutal way Viking society punished feminine men wasn't just about enforcing gender roles. It was about fear of weakness, losing control, and anything that challenged their survival model. Viking life was hard. Their world was built on warfare, raiding, and harsh landscapes. Strength, aggression, and honor were treated as the foundation of their entire culture. Anything soft, passive, foreign, or unpredictable that didn't fit that image was seen as a threat. That's why unmanliness, or Argr, was treated as more than personal behavior. It was treated like a form of corruption. If one man strayed from warrior ideals, others might follow. So, society responded with violence, humiliation, and legal destruction to set an example. These men weren't just punished. They were erased. This wasn't about justice. It was about control through fear. Some of that fear came from outside influence. Men who showed traits linked to non-Viking cultures like sorcery, certain religious practices, passive intimate roles were viewed as contaminated. These behaviors were treated like an infection that could weaken the group. And Norse spiritual beliefs made this even more severe. A man without honor wasn't just rejected socially. He was believed to be denied a place in the afterlife. To be labeled Argr wasn't just about shame, it was about being condemned forever. By punishing feminine men so harshly, the Viking legal system reinforced a message. Only a specific kind of man was worthy of respect, protection, or memory. Everyone else could be cast out, hunted, or forgotten. That mindset didn't disappear with the Viking Age. Even today, some societies still decide who deserves rights, safety, or dignity based on how closely someone fits outdated ideas of masculinity. Men are still pressured to perform toughness, hide emotion, and prove dominance to be accepted. The fear of being seen as not man enough still costs people their reputations, their mental health, and sometimes even their lives. What do you think about the way the Vikings punished feminine men? Feel free to share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Want more videos like this? Then subscribe to the channel for more eye-opening stories. Thank you so much for staying with us till the end. See you in the next video.